Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. There was something comforting about the ritual, the warmth of family, the smell of roasting turkey, and the chance to relax before the frenzy of Christmas took over. That year, though, everything felt different. My brother, Mark, and I had decided to make the trip to our parents' cabin in the mountains. They had retired a few years back, leaving the city for the peace and quiet of the woods. Every year since, they hosted Thanksgiving dinner up there, inviting a few neighbors and close family friends. It was an escape from our busy lives, a chance to breathe in the crisp, fresh air and disconnect from the chaos of work. This year was no exception. The drive up the mountain was uneventful. Mark and I talked about football, our jobs, and how we were both glad to have a few days off. As the sun set behind the towering pine trees, the cabin came into view, a small light glowing from the kitchen window. When we pulled into the driveway, everything seemed as it should be. Mom rushed out to greet us, hugging us tightly, her apron covered in flour. Dad waved from the porch, grinning as he carried a couple of logs into the house for the fireplace. "Glad you boys could make it," Dad said, his usual warm smile on display. "Get yourselves inside and make yourselves at home. Dinner will be ready soon." We hauled our bags inside, the smell of roasting turkey and spices filling the air. The cabin was just as I remembered, cozy, with its old wooden beams, a roaring fire, and the framed family photos that lined the walls. I was home. The guests arrived a little after 6 p.m., Mr. and Mrs. Thompson from next door, and an old family friend, George. Everyone was in high spirits, laughing and catching up. We sat down to eat around 7, and everything was perfect. The food, the company, even the wine flowed generously. For a moment, I forgot about the unsettling feeling that had been nagging at me since we arrived. But that's when things began to unravel. It started with a phone call. Midway through the meal, Dad's cell phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, frowning slightly. "Who could be calling at this hour?" Mom asked, more to herself than anyone else. Dad answered the call, and we all continued eating, assuming it was something trivial. But as we sat there chatting, I noticed the way Dad's expression shifted from mild annoyance to something else entirely. He was no longer just listening, he was tense, his eyes wide as he leaned forward in his chair. "What do you mean?" he asked sharply, his voice low but urgent. The table fell quiet. All eyes were on him now, forks halfway to our mouths. Dad stood up abruptly and walked toward the living room, the phone still pressed to his ear. Mom shot us a confused glance, but we all stayed silent, trying to hear what he was saying. After what felt like forever, Dad returned. His face was pale and his usual warmth was gone. "We need to lock the doors," he said simply. "What? Why?" Mark asked, looking around at the rest of us. "Just do it. Now." There was a seriousness in his voice that made my heart race. We all got up from the table and began locking the doors and windows without question. Something was wrong, very wrong. Once everything was secure, we gathered in the living room, tension thick in the air. Dad sat down heavily in his chair, rubbing his temples. "That was the sheriff," he said. "There was a break-in at one of the cabins down the road about an hour ago." My stomach dropped. We were in the middle of nowhere. Our nearest neighbor was a mile away, and anyone breaking into a cabin up here wasn't just looking for a quick score. There was a deliberate reason for it, and I didn't like where my mind was going. "Did they catch him?" George asked, his voice shaking slightly. Dad shook his head. "No, they think he's still in the area." Suddenly, the coziness of the cabin felt like a trap. The fire's warmth didn't comfort me anymore. Every creak of the old wood, every rustle of the wind outside, set my nerves on edge. We were isolated, and if someone dangerous was nearby, there was nowhere to run. "Why didn't the sheriff call sooner?" Mom asked, her voice tinged with panic. "They didn't realize anyone was up here," Dad explained. "The break-in happened at a seasonal cabin that's supposed to be empty. It wasn't until someone saw the lights from our place that they realized there were people here." For a moment, no one spoke. The cabin, which had always felt so safe and familiar, now seemed like a vulnerable outpost. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, it was the sheer isolation of the place. The nearest town was over an hour away. If something went wrong, help wouldn't arrive in time. Suddenly, the power went out. The entire cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the flickering light from the fireplace. I could hear someone gasp, maybe Mrs. Thompson, but it was hard to tell. The silence that followed was suffocating. "Everyone stay calm," Dad said, though I could hear the tension in his voice. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course not. We were in the mountains. I fumbled for a flashlight in my bag, the beam cutting through the dark, casting long shadows on the walls. "We need to stay together," Mark said. "If someone's out there, they know we're here." Just as he finished speaking, there was a loud bang on the front door. Everyone froze. The sound wasn't a knock, it was more like someone had thrown their full weight against the door. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears, I thought it might drown out the next sound. But there it was again, another bang, this time harder. "Don't open it," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to. Dad grabbed the shotgun he kept mounted above the fireplace. He'd never used it for anything other than scaring off the occasional wild animal, but the look in his eyes told me that he was ready to use it now. For what felt like an eternity, we waited, staring at the door. The banging stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. The air felt thick with tension. Then slowly, we heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. Whoever it was, they were leaving. No one moved, no one spoke. We waited, holding our breath, until finally, after what felt like hours, Dad exhaled. "I think they're gone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff arrived 2 hours later. Whoever had been outside never came back, and they never found out who it was. But to this day, Thanksgiving has never felt the same. I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps, and how close we came to something far worse than we could have imagined. Thanksgiving that year was going to be different. I'd been feeling the strain of the holidays for the past few years, and the idea of spending another one cramped in a small house with my extended family didn't sound appealing. So, when my best friend Tim invited me to spend Thanksgiving with his family at their cabin, I jumped at the chance. Tim's family had a tradition of renting out a cabin in the woods for Thanksgiving, far from the noise of the city. It sounded perfect. Just a small gathering, good food, and plenty of quiet. We headed out early that morning, the cold November air biting at our faces as we loaded up Tim's truck with bags and food supplies. It was a 2-hour drive to the cabin, nestled deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. We arrived just as the sun was starting to set, the sky a brilliant orange. "Here we are," Tim said, pulling into the long gravel driveway that led up to the cabin. Home sweet home for the next couple of days. The cabin was bigger than I expected, a sturdy wooden structure with a large front porch. It looked cozy, with smoke curling from the chimney and lights glowing warmly from the windows. Tim's parents and his younger sister Emma were already inside, busy preparing dinner. We walked in, greeted by the smell of roasting turkey and the sound of Tim's mom humming in the kitchen. Tim's dad gave us a nod from his seat in front of the fireplace, where he was nursing a glass of whiskey. "Glad you made it, boys," he said, not taking his eyes off the crackling fire. I felt at ease right away. The cabin was warm, filled with the scent of wood smoke and spices. We all settled in, making small talk and helping with the final preparations for the meal. Emma was setting the table, humming along to the soft music playing in the background. Everything felt right, calm, peaceful, exactly what I needed. We sat down for dinner just after 6 p.m. The table was overflowing with food: turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, all the Thanksgiving staples. Tim's mom poured us each a glass of wine, and we toasted to the holiday, to being together, and to escaping the craziness of city life for a few days. Halfway through the meal, though, something strange happened. There was a knock at the door. I looked at Tim, who raised an eyebrow. It wasn't like we were expecting anyone. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest house. Who would be knocking on the door? "Maybe it's a neighbor," Tim's dad said, though he didn't sound convinced. Tim got up to answer the door, and we all paused, forks midway to our mouths, listening. I heard the door creak open, and then a man's voice, low and gruff. It wasn't Tim speaking, and I couldn't make out what the man was saying, but it didn't sound like a casual conversation. After a few moments, Tim came back into the dining room, looking puzzled. "Some guy's outside," he said. "He says he's looking for his family, says they're supposed to be staying here." I felt a shiver run down my spine. This cabin wasn't exactly on the beaten path, and it wasn't like there were other cabins nearby. The idea that someone could mistake this place for somewhere else didn't sit right with me. "What do you mean he's looking for his family?" Tim's dad asked, standing up from the table. Tim shrugged. "I don't know. He said his family rented a cabin for Thanksgiving, and they were supposed to meet him here." "That doesn't make any sense," Tim's mom said, frowning. "This cabin's been in our family for years. It's not a rental." Tim's dad walked to the door, Tim following behind him. I glanced at Emma, who looked just as confused as I felt. We all got up and walked to the front door, where the man was standing just outside the porch light. He was tall, wearing a thick coat and a beanie, his face shadowed in the dim light. He looked cold, his breath coming out in visible puffs of air. "I'm sorry," Tim's dad said, "but I think you've got the wrong place. This cabin isn't for rent." The man frowned, looking genuinely confused. "My wife and kids, they were supposed to meet me here. We've been planning this for months. Are you sure?" Tim's dad shook his head. "Positive, it's just us here." The man stood there for a moment, looking past Tim's dad and into the cabin as if he was trying to spot someone he recognized. Then, without another word, he turned and walked off into the darkness, disappearing down the driveway. We all stood there in stunned silence for a moment. "That was weird," Tim muttered. Tim's dad closed the door, locking it behind him. "Let's just get back to dinner," he said, shaking his head. "Probably a mix-up." We all returned to the table, but the mood had shifted. The warmth and coziness of the cabin suddenly felt claustrophobic. The silence between us was heavy, as if we were all waiting for something else to happen. And it did. About 15 minutes later, we heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. A car was coming up the driveway. Tim looked at his dad, who frowned and stood up again, heading for the door. We all followed this time, nervous tension building in the air. When Tim's dad opened the door, we saw headlights shining through the trees, but something was off. The car wasn't pulling into the driveway. It was parked at the edge of the woods, just out of sight, the headlights illuminating the path. We waited, but no one got out of the car. "Maybe we should call someone," Emma whispered. Tim's dad nodded, pulling out his phone, but I could see the frustration on his face when he realized there was no signal. "Let's just sit tight," he said, but his voice lacked confidence. Then, out of the darkness, the man appeared again. He was walking back up the driveway, but this time he wasn't alone. 3 figures followed behind him, 2 adults and a small child, all walking in eerie silence. Before anyone could react, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a gun. "I told you," he said, his voice cold and flat. "This is my family's cabin." We froze. "That's impossible," Tim's dad stammered, hands up in surrender. But the man didn't care. He nodded to his family, who slowly advanced toward us, their faces blank and emotionless. And that's when I realized the people with him weren't his family. They were strangers, strangers like us. And we weren't the first group to make this mistake. Thanksgiving had always been a quiet affair for me. No big family gatherings, no bustling kitchens filled with cousins and aunts, just me, my wife, Claire, and our daughter Lily. We lived out in the countryside, a good 30-minute drive from the nearest town. We liked it that way, peaceful, away from the crowds. It gave us time to unwind from our hectic jobs, and for a while, I thought it was the perfect setting for a peaceful life. That Thanksgiving, however, would shatter all of that. It started off like any other holiday. Claire had woken up early to start cooking, and the smell of roasting turkey and pumpkin pie filled the house. I played with Lily in the living room, trying to keep her entertained while Claire worked her magic in the kitchen. We didn't have any guests coming that year, which was fine by me. I liked it just being the 3 of us. We were enough. Around noon, I noticed something odd. Out the corner of my eye, through the large window that faced the front yard, I saw someone walking down the long dirt road that led to our house. Now, it wasn't entirely unusual to see people walking around, but our road wasn't exactly the kind of place you stumbled upon by accident. It was private property, and our house was the only one for miles. Did you invite anyone for dinner? I asked Claire, trying to sound casual. She looked up from the pie she was cutting, puzzled. No, just us. Why? Someone's walking up the road, I said, standing up and moving closer to the window. Claire joined me at the window, squinting to see who it was. That's strange, she murmured. Maybe they're lost. The figure got closer, and soon enough I could make out more details. It was a man older, maybe in his 50s or 60s, wearing a thick coat and a baseball cap. He didn't look threatening, but there was something off about the way he walked. He moved slowly, methodically, as if he knew exactly where he was going. Should we go check? Claire asked, a little uneasy. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out onto the porch, keeping an eye on the man as he approached. As I did, Claire called Lily to come to the kitchen, not wanting her to see what was going on. By the time I got to the front yard, the man was just a few feet away. He looked weathered, like someone who had been walking for a long time. Afternoon, I said, trying to sound friendly but firm. Can I help you with something? The man stopped, looked me up and down, and then smiled. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. Beautiful day, he said in a raspy voice, ignoring my question. You got a lovely home here. Mind if I come in? Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. There was no explanation, no introduction, just an assumption that he would be welcome. But this wasn't some friendly neighbor dropping by. Sorry, I said, taking a step back. We're just having a family dinner today. You might want to head into town if you're looking for something. The man's smile faltered, and for a brief moment his eyes darkened. I've walked a long way, he said. A real long way. Least you could do is offer a meal. It's Thanksgiving after all, isn't it? His words were calm, but there was an edge to them, like a challenge. I'm sorry, I repeated, more firmly this time. We don't have room for any guests today. The man stared at me for a long moment. I could feel the weight of his gaze, and I didn't like it. Finally, he nodded, turning slowly as if to leave. But before he walked away, he said something under his breath. It was so quiet I almost didn't catch it. I'll be seeing you. I stood there for a while, watching him walk back down the road until he disappeared around a bend. The whole interaction left me uneasy, but I shook it off and went back inside. I didn't tell Claire what he'd said. I didn't want to worry her. We spent the rest of the afternoon cooking, playing with Lily, and trying to enjoy the day. But that nagging feeling in my gut never went away. As the sun set and we sat down for dinner, I couldn't stop glancing at the window. The dirt road was still empty, but the memory of the stranger's words hung in the back of my mind. I'll be seeing you. I told myself it was nothing, just some oddball looking for a handout, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After dinner, I went outside to take out the trash. The night had grown colder, and the air was thick with fog. As I approached the garbage bins at the side of the house, I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. I stopped, holding my breath. The footsteps paused, then started again, slowly, deliberately, getting closer. I spun around, heart pounding, and saw him. The man from earlier was standing just at the edge of the yard, barely visible in the dim light. He wasn't walking toward me, he was standing completely still, watching me. "What the hell are you doing?" I called out, taking a step forward. "I told you to leave." He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring at me with those cold, dark eyes. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. This wasn't a coincidence. He had come back, just like he said he would. I backed away, keeping my eyes on him as I hurried toward the house. I locked the door behind me, my heart racing. Claire looked up from the living room, noticing the panic on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, coming over to me. "He's back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The guy from earlier, he's outside, watching the house." Claire's face went pale. "What do we do?" I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 as I peeked through the curtains. But when I looked outside, the man was gone. There was no sign of him, no movement, no sound, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into the night. The dispatcher assured me they would send someone out to check the area, but by the time the police arrived, the man was long gone. They searched the woods, the road, even questioned a few neighbors, but no one had seen him. It was like he had never been there. The officers left, telling us to call again if anything else happened. We locked every door and window that night, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was still out there, waiting. The next morning, as we were cleaning up from Thanksgiving, I went outside to check the mail. There on the porch was something that stopped me cold. A note, scribbled in messy handwriting, was tucked under the doorframe. It read, "I told you I'd be seeing you." But the thing that made my blood run cold wasn't the message, it was the other side of the note. It was one of Lily's drawings, one we had pinned on the fridge. He had been inside,